1923 with Harrison Ford and Helen Mirren. It's a fantastic show, and it also teaches us some lessons on economics. Now today, we are going to look at a conflict and how property rights and what's known as the Coase Theorem gives us a solution to a really bad problem that's happening in the TV show 1923. Let's start with the clip.
They killed all sheep. Littered the forest with them. Now I deserve an answer. You know the bastards who murdered my sheep because you know who has the lease to where their bodies lay.
So you admit you're on someone else's lease?
Sheep, they wander. They don't know where one lease ends and another begins.
And why have leases at all? Sheep eat to the root. They ruin the grass for cattle or anything else to eat. One could argue you killed his livestock too. It just took him longer to die. Until it rains, there'll be no grazing in the valley.
Really dramatic scene here. And while I'm talking, you're going to get a visual of the cattle and the sheep in Montana in the series as it's set in 1923. Well, we have a major problem here. One neighbor owns sheep. They need open fields to graze. The other owns cattle. And if the sheep eat, they're going to destroy the grass so much that the cattle might die as well. So we've got a big problem here. What are the possible solutions, right? Well, the sheep herders think, well, the sheep, they just need to roam. You know, what else can we do? We have to let the sheep roam. So the sheep, could they have the rights to an undisturbed field? Then, you know, that's one possible solution. An alternative is the cattle owner doesn't allow the sheep to roam whatsoever. The sheep are just simply not allowed to roam. What really all of this comes down to is a case of property rights. Who indeed owns the property? And if the property rights are well defined, what we should see here is a solution where the more efficient party indeed gets use of the land. Why does this happen? Well, Ronald Coase, who's a Nobel Prize winning economist, came up with what is named after him, the Coase Theorem. What the Coase Theorem states is that if property rights are well defined and that the transaction cost, like the ability to negotiate and the costs for enforcing, are reasonably low, private parties should be able to negotiate solutions to eliminate what are called externalities. And they should be able to do this without the government getting involved. Now, externalities are side effects, and the side effects are what we indeed see here. So if the cattle are roaming and the sheep need the particular land to graze, right, the cattle could damage the opportunity for the sheep. If the sheep are damaging the opportunity for the cattle, that's the flip side. So what would the Coase Theorem suggest happens in this particular case? Well, one thing that's interesting is that it really doesn't matter who would own the land. The same solution should actually happen. If the value to the sheep herders is more than the value to the cattle ranchers, what should happen is the sheep herders would find a price to pay those who are the cattle ranchers to let the sheep graze on the land. Right? Imagine that the value of the 500 sheep grazing is $1 million, and the value of the cattle there is 100,000. Well, there's a price in between the million and the 100,000 where both sides are better off, even if it's the cattle rancher who owns the particular land. The opposite would also be true, although it wouldn't really be an exchange. If the sheep herders just owned the land, then the cattle ranchers, if the value is $100,000, the sheep herders would never take that. The sheep are going to get to use that particular land. Either way, we get to an efficient outcome because the parties are going to negotiate, and whoever can use the property more efficiently will end up figuring out a way to use the property, whether they own it in the first place or whether there is a cash payment. So the person who owns the property is letting the other person use it. What we see in 1923 is actually a whole lot of mess on a lot of different dimensions. So what is happening in this particular case that seems to be going so wrong? Well, one question could be, are the property rights really enforced very well? The sheep were just grazing as if the sheep herders really didn't care or know about the property rights whatsoever. And if the property rights are not well defined, that actually can lead to a lot of problems, especially environmental problems. Environmental problems are handled much more efficiently if there are clear and well-defined property rights. Further, you will run into the conflicts if you do not have the property rights well defined. One of the more classic problems that's often discussed in economics and in political science is thought of as the tragedy of the commons. If there is a common area and the property rights aren't well defined, it might get overused in the short term by, say, having sheep graze. Why? Well, others will have an incentive to use it in the short term, and they know that if others are using it in the short term, it won't be as good in the long term. So everybody has this pressure to use a particular piece of property in the short term, and then it might indeed destroy the fields for the future. The tragedy of the commons, it's also thought about with fishing stocks, right? If you have a stock of fish and only some small subset of fish are harvested from a pond, a river, a lake, whatever, in a given year, the fish population will remain stable. However, there can be a short-term incentive for any one entity to try to overfish, and if they overfish, that's going to reduce the future well-being. But everybody knows this incentive is there, so what happens? You might see a big rush to overfish, and the population is dwindled down dramatically, which greatly, greatly harms the future ability of fish to repopulate the river, the stream, whatever. 1923, this conflict, and of course the conflict is part of the story, it's very much based in real world issues, but these real world issues are solved if there are well-defined property rights and well-defined law enforcement. When that happens, you should see a solution. It shouldn't get as nasty as we see that it gets within the TV show. Once again, my name's Matt Rosu. I like making economics fun and accessible, so I hope you enjoyed this. This is part of a series on 1923 and the economic lessons we can learn from it. So check out some of the other videos that I posted, and please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.